That work? Thank you. Yes, it did. That's good. Okay, lovely. Right. Well, hello, everybody. Apologies for putting you all on mute as you entered. It feels kind of intrusive to do that, but to be honest, there isn't really very much choice because given my sensory um, ability to cope today, especially, I wouldn't have been able to deal with, kind of chatter and small talk and stuff like that going on at the beginning, if indeed there was any small talk, which is fairly unlikely, to be honest. But yeah, I need it quiet. I've had a really bad headache most of the day, but I wanted to soldier on anyway because I had a bit of a spell last year of cancelling these kind of things a bit last minute, which, to be honest, is pretty. I don't feel too bad about it, if I'm honest with you. People got refunds if it cost and stuff like that. So I think we have to be kind to ourselves. But even so, I didn't want to fall back into the trap of cancelling all the time and spending people's goodwill like that. So yes, bit of a bad head today, but I'm alive. I'm fine. I'm kind of coping, so it's all good. Now, in terms of cameras and stuff like that, I don't know whether anyone has any opinions on it. Personally, it is actually quite nice to have cameras on. Just so I don't feel like I'm talking to a dark space. Don't feel that you have to. There's no pressure at all if you don't want to show yourself. If you're, doing this from the loo or your hair's not at its best today, then fair play. I'm not going to force anything. But if people want to turn them on, it's just nice to see faces. I very much rely on kind of visual feedback when I'm talking. I've found. I think being a teacher for so long, you it's become second nature to kind of gauge how you're doing by the faces on the kids. Like if they're all looking at you like this, then you kind of know, okay, maybe I need to take a step back. Let's start again. Whereas if they're all kind of, engaged and, that kind of lovely light in their eyes kind of look that some kids have, in year 7 and 8 anyway, then you know that you're doing a good job and you can carry on. So I very much rely heavily on that. So thank you to all of you that have put your cameras on. Like I say, I'm happy to do a Q&A at the end if people do have any questions. But given the limitations of the technology and given the limitations of myself, I think I'd like to keep it nice and straightforward until then and just have me talking at you, if that's okay. If I feel brave, if my confidence goes up and I'm kind of feeling snazzy, then maybe I'll be like, oh, let's have some questions now. Why not? But don't bet on it. Don't bet on it at all. The likelihood is that I'll just kind of soldier on till maybe about, I don't know, 1:45 or something like that. And then we can open it out into a big discussion or Q&A, or I could just let you talk to each other if you fancy it. I really don't mind. So yeah, I'm just letting people in as they show up. So yeah, thanks for everyone that's come along tonight. I didn't really advertise it beyond, once I'd filled it, I kind of forgot about it a little bit and I didn't advertise it any further. So I was a little bit worried that maybe people would forget, but I know that Eventbrite does send out reminders. So hopefully they came through and gave you a bit of a push and, like this is happening today. But after this is over sorry, loud motorbikes. After this is over tonight, I think what I'm going to do is set up another free one, probably about a month's time or so. I'd quite like to make these a fairly regular thing, to be honest with you. Especially now I'm working quite a lot on my next book because that's quite heavy work, and it's quite nice to have a bit of a break, a bit of a, this isn't exactly, super socializing, but it's a nice kind of level of socializing that I can actually cope with. So it's actually quite pleasant to do. Anyway, I'm babbling on. As was advertised, I'm going to be talking a little bit tonight about autistic special interests and why they're so important and why we have them perhaps and what the deal is with them. I'm going to assume, because I think it's wise to assume, that we are going to have a very heavily neurodivergent audience here. But I'm also going to assume, given the nature of my kind of the people that read my page on Facebook and such, that there might also be quite a few neurodivergent adjacent people here, neurotypical parents, perhaps neurotypical colleagues. I don't know. Hopefully there'll be a very broad church here and a lot of varied experiences. But that is what I'm going to assume. I'm going to assume that the majority of people have a decent understanding of the basics. So if I do skip over anything in a very lackadaisical fashion that you're not sure about, that could form a question for the Q&A at the end. if you're not sure what I meant by X, Y, or Z, that's fine. So yeah, that's what I'm going to spend the rest of this time talking about. I've just been taking photos. Speaking about special interests, I've just been taking photographs of the blue tit family. That I think it's a family. It must be a family. I mean, I can't unless it's like a school. Do they have schools? Do they have nurseries? Do they take other birds' children out, feed them on bird feeders? I don't know. I don't know what blue tit society is like, how advanced it is. But certainly, there's a couple of very harried, very, very ragged looking adult blue tits. They look rough, much like I guess I did about 8 years ago. And they're flying around with what looks like 4 or 5, maybe even 6. It's very hard to count them because they're always moving. But a large group of fledglings, of really young ones that haven't quite developed the colours yet. They've got the pattern, but they haven't got the colour. And they're showing them how to eat, and they're feeding them. They've got bits of seeds in their mouth, and they're kind of passing them on. And it's just the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen. It's ridiculous. And because the young ones are so untested and as yet unafraid of man, I can just stand by my kitchen window fairly openly taking photos of these guys, and they don't flinch. They don't care. So I'm getting these lovely, relatively close-up shots. The only thing standing in my way is the dirtiness of the kitchen window, to be honest. The smears and the lime scale smears and all that kind of thing. But apart from that, I'm getting some lovely clear shots, which is great. It does seem to be one of my more low-key special interests at the moment, the whole bird feeding thing. It's one of those low energy, ongoing interest rather than a really intense, focused one, I guess. But yeah, it's certainly it's certainly up there for me at the moment as something that I'm getting a lot of joy from. So today, then, special interests. First of all, I want to address the elephant in the room. I'm not trying to insult anyone. The elephant in the room here is the term special interest. Let's face it, whenever you talk about autism or neurodivergence generally, the elephant in the room is always going to be language based. If it's not language based, it will be representation based. They are going to always be the things that are potentially highly problematic in any situation. Which I think it's a good idea to accept, to open up to and to recognize and to kind of hold our hands up and say this is an issue. In this case, I think that the language around this is open to controversy of various types. Some people really don't mind the term special interest. Other people hate it with an absolute passion. I use it primarily out of habit, as I do everything in life, quite honestly. It's more of a routine thing for me. I quite like the shortened, accurate, the shortened version of spin. I don't know if you come across that. SPIN, spin. That's quite nice. That works for me. People spins. It also kind of sits well with stim. It's like stims and spins, which I think is really pleasant to say. So I'm okay with that. But I know that some people have an issue with the term special because of the connotations that's developed over the last 30 or 40 years, which I think is fair enough. It's a word that is absolutely swamped by connotation and association and things like that. Personally, I kind of like the idea of reclaiming it a little bit. I quite like the idea of trying to retain it as a word just generally because it's quite a useful word, but I can understand if people don't. So if you would rather consider or think about using terms like hyperfocuses or hyperfixations, then by all means do. Just be mindful of the fact that some of these words, I think, as we move through and the vocabulary does start to settle. I feel like the vocabulary around autism is a bit like the snow in a snow globe, or I called it a snow. What did we used to call snow globes? That's an American term, isn't it? Snow globe. I've just realised that we used to call them something else. The UK, we must have had our own term for it. I can't for the life of me. I mean, obviously, precious things. If you're a fan of the League of Gentlemen, but that's a different thing. I'm sure they had their own name that I don't know. If anyone remembers, put it in the chat. I'll be happy to see it. But I feel like the language around autism is a bit like the snow in a snow shaker, snow globe, precious thing, in that it's still very much whirling around at the moment. It hasn't settled on the ground yet. I don't know whether it will. I mean, presumably it will. I mean, obviously we make a big thing about language is always changing. That is true. But also, to be fair, language does settle. Language change isn't quite as fast, I think, as some people claim it to be. But at the moment, it feels like the language around autism is still completely up in the air and still taking quite a long time to fall to the ground and to feel set. And I think that could cause a lot of anxiety. I think people, especially people new to the space, newly diagnosed, or parents with newly diagnosed kids, or anyone who, for whatever reason, is kind of fresh to the space, it can be quite intimidating, I think. Hence why I'm saying now, I personally don't mind. I'm not going to be offended by what anyone uses in the chat or when you're doing Q&A. We all have our preferences. We all have our things that we would like to use. But I'm probably going to use special interests, to be honest, because, as I say, that's my habit, that's my routine, that's what this book, was all about all those years ago now. And the last time I want to, start thinking about using new languages in a, public space like this one, I'm probably just going to get it wrong. So, special interests, let's park that about the language. We've addressed that now. We will deal with that on our own individual level. Well, what are they? Well, as any autistic person knows pretty well, special interests certainly have the potential to be an incredibly central part of the autistic experience. If it were up to me to kind of delineate what autism really is, I tend to simplify it down to sensory differences. Yeah, great. That's a big thing for many of us. Communication differences. We communicate, in a different way. We have a different set of rules, it seems, in how we communicate, and interests, focus, monotropism, I guess you could refer to it, as a kind of broad term. It's so central an aspect of being autistic. But I do feel like it is often overlooked. But then I feel like most things in this kind of sphere are often overlooked. But I feel like special interests are often maybe pushed to one side for a little bit. I think it's because they're potentially a little bit more difficult to talk about. Because I think there's a temptation on our part. If you're an autistic advocate, there is maybe a temptation to talk about your special interest, whatever it might be, rather than the actual phenomenon of special interests. It's like it's a really easy kind of trap that you can fall into, where I just end up talking about Sonic the Hedgehog for an hour rather than what special interests actually are. But I also feel like they're not as interesting and exciting to the non-autistic audience. I don't feel like they capture the imagination of Snowstorm, David has said. I think you're right. I think Snowstorm. I think that probably is what we called it. Yeah, that feels right to me. I like that, Snowstorm. Yeah. Anyway, I don't feel like special interests quite capture the imagination of neurotypicals in the same way that our sensory differences, communication differences. I mean, I can hook neurotypicals so easily by talking, for example, about small talk or eye contact. Like immediately you've got them in the palm of your hand because they find it kind of fascinating, this alternative perspective on something that they do. It's just something that seems to go down very well. And it's the same with sensory stuff. You tend to find a lot of relatability there. But if you start talking about the phenomenon of special interest, I don't know, it just often feels like eyes glaze over, interest is lost a little bit, which is ironic given that is so often what happens when we talk about our actual special interests. It's like it's just part of that whole problem. So it's an integral part of being an autistic person. Our brains seem to be, for whatever reason, very highly attuned to get into the space of focusing on individual topics in tremendous detail. That, of course, is monotropism in a nutshell. The concept of the monotropic brain, and the idea being, of course, that autistic people have monotropic brains, is that our brains are, for want of a better word, because this isn't a good word, but please bear with me because, it's a useful word. Our brains are designed for that kind of deep focus. Now, it's a problematic word because, of course, evolution is not designed. I'm personally not a creationist, I'm not a religious man. So when I say designed, I don't mean like actively designed. I mean they are evolved and set, and that's just how they work. Autistic brains simply work by fixating and focusing on a single topic, a single thing, a single point of focus that we are then able to really engage with in tremendous depth and often tremendous capability as well. That often comes, not always, you can be focused on something you're terrible at, but often capability comes in the end, just from the sheer amount of practice you might be engaging in, or the sheer amount of reading or experience you gain in whatever the topic is. And a monotropic focus tunnel, I think Kieran Rose likes to refer to it as a tunnel, like a gravity tunnel. I've often heard him talk about that, which I quite like. That tunnel of attention can fixate itself, as far as I can tell, to basically anything that takes our fancy, anything that just hooks our attention in. It's like a fish on a hook. Our attention's kind of constantly swimming around, looking for something. Like free as a bird, but hoping to be caught on something. I think that's why ADHD often gets drawn into this. It's a very similar kind of scenario, isn't it? Kind of just flighting, zipping around left and right until suddenly, bang, something's got you, and you are there and you are focused on that thing. And as I say, I mean, today for me, for example, I've been in a bit of a monotropic flow state recently, on and off, reading about. No, I'm not. I'm going to be honest with you. I was about to give an example of something that I have done today, but actually, the true monotropic focus that I've been undergoing today has been Sporkle quizzes. You ever done Sporkle? You ever played a Sporkle quiz? It's a website of just basically billions of different quizzes. And I've been fixated heavily on Pokemon Sporkle quizzes today. I don't know why. It just caught my attention, and I've spent a very happy few hours today with my head hurting, just kind of finding this just to be a really soothing thing to do. And for me, it's not, I wouldn't call it a special interest, just, doing quizzes on Pokemon, but Pokemon is a special interest. But doing quizzes is it tickles the brain in a very pleasing way. And for me, that's often what monotropic focus feels like. It's like you're giving your brain a really nice massage, or you're soothing it, or you're like giving your brain a spa day, whatever that would look like. I don't know, but that's how it feels. It feels like you're really treating it with tremendous generosity and calm, and allowing your brain, I should say, to sink into something that it truly loves. And for me today, that was Pokemon quizzes. There was a particular type of quiz that I just got hooked on. It was the 60 most and least powerful Pokemon of every type. I mean, wow, the depth of that. Sitting there thinking, oh God, what is the strongest ice type Pokemon? And what's the weakest? I can't remember. I've got to dig that up from somewhere in my head. And it was wonderful. That tunnel of attention that I ended up in by really focusing on this particular interest of mine and trying to complete the quiz, it brought me tremendous peace, calm, joy, and I guess it's fair to say regulation. Because that's often what these interests and what these monotropics kind of tunnel experiences really do bring more than anything. They bring self-regulation. They help temper the enormous stress that we as autistic people are usually, I mean, I say usually, I mean always under. It's a very lucky autistic person. You do meet them, but it's a very lucky autistic person who doesn't experience enormous amounts of stress on a daily basis. And engaging in special interests, allowing your brain to be in that monotropic flow that it is designed to be in, really helps with that. It really gives you a bit of space to let your brain feel, well, I mean, to be honest with you, I personally think, I don't think there's much research on this. I'm not even sure how there could be, but I personally think that autistic brains are meant to be in their monotropic state pretty much all the time. I think that's our natural resting state. We're just not able to be because of the way that the world has developed. Um, the world does not build that much space for monotropic flow. There isn't a whole lot of time and space available to the average person, at least, to be able to sink yourself into a specific, often very precise topic for a prolonged period. Work, life, school, employment, family, friends, they tend to get in the way of being able to truly engage in that. And I think that that is possibly one of the great sources of stress that we have as a group, as a community, as a population, because we're not quite able to let our brains be how our brains need to be for long enough or often enough. I mean, I don't know. This is where you might start to see an increase in my confidence, because I think I'm about to ask people something. So let's see how this goes. Let's see where this takes us. I mean, how many of you genuinely feel, if you yourself are autistic, how many of you genuinely feel that this week, for example, it's Thursday, isn't it? So this week so far, you have had enough time to really feel satisfied by your engagement with your favorite hobbies and interests? Have we had the time for that? Feel free to put it in the chat if you want. By all means do, because I see it pop up and I can reflect on it. Now, obviously, we've got to be careful here, because you could ask that to a neurotypical person, and they'd probably say, so, like, who's got enough time for anything? And I don't want to, dismiss the, neurotypical people are stressed too. Of course they are, but I think there's something more fundamental at work here. Where we are not getting a basic need that, if I had my way, would be inserted into an autistic specific Maslow's hierarchy, where time with special interest, time with our favorite hobbies should actually be up there with, like, eating, drinking, sleeping, as far as I'm concerned. I'm a little bit tongue in cheek with that, but not much. I really feel it's that important. It's that fundamental to our well-being, to just be in that mind space. And some people, when I've mentioned this, especially in workplaces, have said, well, you would say that about video games and all your hobbies that you have. Of course, you want more time with them. I'm not really talking, though, about the actual specific nature of the special interest here. Not really. I'm talking about the way the brain feels when it's in that special interest, because they are two slightly different things. Monotropic flow is different to a special interest. The monotropic flow is a process. It's a feeling. It's a state of being that an autistic person can be in, whereas the special interest is often the focus of that state of being, or the object of it, if you like. And my point here isn't so much to do with the object, it's to do with the process and the state of being. We are not allowed to be in that state of being enough, because that state of being could be directed at our work. It could be directed at our studies if we're at school. It could be directed at our family or friends. Like I said, monotropic flow can be directed at pretty much anything. But even those things, I don't think we find the space and the time in the day to fully let ourselves go into it. Even a work task. I mean, how many of us are lucky enough to have a job where we can just fully immerse ourselves in a long, lengthy, maybe even open-ended task for as long as we need? Not many of us. Some of us, I mean, I am, for example, I'm a writer, so technically my working life is a bit like that. But when I do my speaking gigs, no, because, after you've been talking for an hour, they tell you to stop. And I'll be like, no, I don't want to. I'm in the zone now. I'm in a monotropic flow. I'm just, I'm talking, but you have to stop. You have to fit in with people's schedules. You have to recognize the timetable, the itinerary, the passage of time, which is one of my greatest enemies. And for that reason, we are not as much allowed into that headspace as we probably need to be. I don't know what the solution to that is, other than a wholesale rebellion, Andor style, where we annihilate the Death Star of scheduling. and usher in a new world where everyone is just free to spend as much time as they like on anything. But doesn't that make you wonder, though, about the fundamentals of life? The things that we just take for granted, the things that we assume are immovable, unchangeable aspect of life. Like, I have this conversation with schools a lot, because there is a general consensus amongst teachers and school staff generally, and students, and most other people as well, that the school day is a series of lessons interspersed with breaks and lunches. That's such a fundamental norm across the whole world that it's actually it's hard to kind of rebel against it. And people don't tend to take it very well when you try. When you say to a teacher or a head teacher, well, what would a school day without lessons look like? You get marched out of the front door, by security, because it's such a ridiculously off the wall concept, because society has deemed it for the last however many hundred years that this is simply how things work. The world, society, civilization decided to chunk things down into short periods of time, didn't they? That's what happened. In a variety of different ways. Oh, I'm getting very philosophical already. That's a bad sign. But in a variety of different ways, society decided that what we needed was a world where everything was broken down, chunked down into half-hour, hour-long chunks, whether it's lessons at school or work tasks or meetings or TV programs or radio programs or how we travel, how we spend our time at home generally. We live in a world which is predicated around this basic concept of time is broken, time is chunked, time is split into bits. The very system of time that we utilize is split into hours, minutes, and seconds. It doesn't have to be. That didn't have to happen, but it did. And my contention here, and like I said, I've gone far too philosophical far too quickly, because there's nothing any of us can do about this. But my contention here is the reason that we ended up in this situation of having time chunked down into these small set pieces is because the world is fundamentally operated on a polytropic level. Because polytropic people, can go from task to task, activity to activity, focus to focus, whenever they need to, more or less, without too much trouble. For a polytropic person, so probably not autistic, not ADHD, they can go from geography to maths without any problem. They can go from watching Coronation Street to Brookside. God, how old am I? With no issue. That it's second nature to them. Whereas autistic, monotropic people will always feel like we don't fit that. I think, personally, I think we don't fit that in such a fundamental way that we always therefore feel alien, like we don't fit here. We need to somehow be in a world where time wasn't chunked down like that, where time was viewed in a more open-ended way. It's almost impossible to even imagine what that would look like, because that is not how the world is set up. But presumably it could have been, and it could be. I don't know. It's just, I think it's important to get to that, because first of all, it's something I feel tremendously strongly about. And it's going to be a big focus in one of the chapters in my new book that I'm writing at the moment, where I'm going to try and get schools to recognize, at the very least, they are trying to make autistic kids do something that is very unnatural to them. Even if they can't change it, they need to at least recognize the demand of that, the pressure of that, and react accordingly. But I do feel really strongly about this. I feel like we need to kind of recognize this, almost that we are, in our daily lives, we are constantly up against it in this way. We are constantly thwarted when trying to achieve monotropic flow, when trying to get into a state, because our schedules are too busy, the time is too chunked up. And I'm just going to check the chat, because I know people were saying a lot about that, about the kind of jobs that people have. I'm just having a quick look here. Yeah, forgetting to eat, the working day, people, yeah, I mean, vets and things like that. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to find those decent chunks of time. And I don't know how it is for you, but for me, I know that I feel best if I've allowed myself at least a good couple of hours, to really engage in just one thing that I enjoy. Not necessarily a hobby, just something that I'm comfortable doing. Could even be work, or tidying the house. But I want to feel like I can do it for a prolonged period, and so often I can't. So I guess if we want to turn this into an actual useful session, where people actually walk away with an idea of what to maybe do, because I don't want to just be moaning. I think a lot of autistic people, myself included, might benefit might benefit from being kind of given permission. You got to give yourself permission to do that. You've got to give yourself permission to spend a lot of time on something. The biggest thing that I find, that the biggest kind of demographic that I find this is really problematic with, is families. With kids, and you get to the weekend, and it's like, now it's the weekend. We've got to be seen to be, looking after our children properly. So now we've got to do 1,000 things all weekend. Just zip from thing to thing and fit in all these trips and shopping and visits to family and all this kind of thing on Saturday and Sunday. Otherwise, we've wasted the time. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. If your kids are autistic, this is going to burn them out. And if you're autistic too, it's going to burn you out as well. And by the time you get to Monday, you are not going to be able to deal with what comes. But I see it over and over again, that pressure that society puts on us, again, to chunk time down and to fill it with activities is really intense. I'll never, ever forget, looking back now that I know that I'm autistic and my father's autistic too. So I sometimes look back to our trip to Disneyland Paris, when I was I was 18. It was more for my sister. She was 10. But I had fun too. I can't be too cool for school. It was an enjoyable trip. But I remember so vividly. We arrived in the park, through the main gates, and the dynamic of the family. Even though I was 18, the dynamic still very much was dad's in charge. It's that very old-fashioned kind of patriarchal kind of crap. But my dad was the lead kind of figure, I guess. And it was really weird because we walked through and he just took off. Like, he didn't run or anything. Like, he didn't just like leave us in the dust. But he just started power walking forward, and we were running to catch up. And he was just plowing through, all the way down the market street, with all the shops, and through the castle square. And we got about as far as Cinderella's castle before I kind of jogged up to him to catch him and said, "Where are you going?" And he turned to me and he looked at me with like a look of panic in his eyes. I don't know. We've just got to move, haven't we? We've got to do this. And now I'm a parent, and I look back on that and I recognize what he was doing. He was desperately flailing to try to make the experience as full as it could be, but doing it in a particularly autistic way of just kind of flying like an arrow through the whole park, not taking anything in, not going on any rides, in this kind of misguided sense of we've got to see and do everything. So basically that just means we've got to move very quickly through this place. And I get it. That's the pressure that we're under, I think, as people in this society, to just try and squeeze as much into our days as we possibly can. I take a lot of pleasure in. Look, I've got a guilty pleasure. I really, really, really enjoy reading Americans' plans for touring the United Kingdom when they come here on holiday. I love it, because what they'll do is they'll go on Reddit and they'll post their itinerary that they've been working on, and they'll be like, "Hey everyone, hey British people, do you think this itinerary?" I'm not going to do an accent. "Do you think this itinerary is realistic?" And it'll be like, 2 days in London, and whilst in London, we are going to go to literally every museum that exists, every single one. Every meal will be a showcase meal at a named restaurant. We won't be getting a quick sandwich from Costa. Oh no, we are going to be having proper sit-down meals in all these different places. And then it'll be like, then on the Tuesday, we're going to go to Bath. And then we're going to explore the Cotswolds. And we're going to go to Jeremy Clarkson's farm. And then we're going to go to Bristol. And then we're going to head down to Cornwall. And it's like, what, in a day? Oh, yes. Well, we've figured it out. UK's small. And it's like, what are you doing? You know, you're going to have a horrible, horrible time. You see it everywhere, I think, this evidence of this pressure. And I think that as autistic people, we are uniquely vulnerable to it. Uniquely vulnerable to it. Because it won't just cause us to be tired at the end of the day and grumpy because we didn't actually get to sit down and have a nice pint whilst in Bath or whilst in the Cotswolds. It will actively burn us out really quickly. And it will actively impact on mental health incredibly quickly. You know, the anxiety and the depression that will come from that, I think, it hits pretty fast, I think, from personal experience, when we are not giving ourselves time and space to engage in our monotropic tunnel flow state, you know, and get on with our special interests and such. So I think it's really important to carve out that time where you can. And you know, if you're a parent, if you're a parent to young children, that can feel pretty much impossible. I know that very well. But it's still, if you prize it enough, I think. I know this sounds like a bit of a cop out, but if you do truly prioritize it, in the same way that you might prioritize taking your kid to an extracurricular activity, because you always find, you know, you tend to find the time for that, don't you? Because of, you know, you don't want the lead teacher to notice that they're missing again. You know, you feel the kind of pressure there. Give yourself the same pressure. Find that time. You know, it's for your own good and it's for your own benefit. Because I think that our autistic brains, it just needs that. And if we don't provide it for ourselves, if we can't carve out, dig out, create that space for ourselves, it can be a very bleak picture. And this is true also of our loved ones. You know, if you're not autistic yourself, but you've got autistic kids, you know, have a think about what you do at the weekend. Have a think about how you let them spend their evenings. You know, I posted a meme recently on Instagram because that's what I do. That's my life. Which, you know, was about how screen time isn't necessarily the enemy. And I actually expected a lot of negativity to that, but I didn't really get very much. I think a couple of years ago, you would have got a lot of parents like, oh, no, we can't just let, you know, we can't let iPads educate our children. I think that actually attitudes are changing a little bit and people are recognizing that actually screen time for many autistic kids is basically their shortcut to monotropism. It's their shortcut to monotropic flow, and it's being recognised as such, and the value of it then is quite clear. I would hesitate before ever suggesting to anyone that their autistic child should limit their screen time. I mean, there are good reasons for it. Don't get me wrong. You know, I mean, it is obviously possible to be addicted. It is obviously possible to spend too much time on YouTube and to end up going down rabbit holes that are very unpleasant, where you know, become. There's real dangers there, but we shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And breathe. Right. I haven't actually done a talk for about a week or so. So this is like a whole week's worth of wanting to talk about neurodivergence, all happening all at once to you good people. I'm going to talk a little bit, because I've noticed the time, a little bit about actual special interests, because I've realized that what I've mostly talked about is monotropism here. What I've mostly talked about is the kind of mechanism of it rather than the thing itself, if that makes sense. So just a few words on special interests or hyperfocuses or hyperfixations or whatever you want to call them. They can, of course, be anything. I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but there is still such a myth out there that it will be the same stuff always. You know, that it will be trains, that it will be video games, that it will be the Titanic. I mean, I'm a walking bloody stereotype. I'm perfectly aware of this. I am an incredibly stereotypical autistic man. I really am. Anyone that's read my first book will know this. Video games, dinosaurs, Titanic, Marvel, Minecraft, Lego. I mean, come on, Pete. For God's sake, come up with something a bit different. I think my fascination with ghosts is maybe a little bit different. Not massively, but a little bit. Maps is a fairly common one. So yeah, I'm aware of where I'm preaching from here. I'm not a good example of this myself personally, but special interest can basically be anything. Anything, in my view at least, that seems to contain enough possibility to hold a person's attention. You know, and actually, Lucy just said, I'd love to know lists of other people. There's an activity. If you're sitting there a bit bored of hearing me talk and you're waiting for the Q&A section, now's your opportunity to take a bit of time. Why don't you list yours in the chat? Then we can all I don't know, that feels like a really nice thing to do. We don't know each other enough to be able to kind of, really do very much with that information. It's just nice to know what people like. I think I've given you mine. I've given you a whole book about mine. You can put yours down. I think special interests do need to have a kind of autism. Yeah. Same here. Yeah, absolutely. I'm terrified of the day where autism, how sometimes your special interest just gone, just evaporates into nothing. I'm terrified of that happening to me with autism. Absolutely terrified, because it's the only thing that fuels me. When I'm doing this mudlarking. Nice. Actually, little weird thing. My second book, Untypical, the publisher was called Mudlark, which I always really liked because that whole thing is so fun. Magic apparatus. You see, I hear about apparatus, and all I think about is that framework at primary school that never was used during PE lessons. But I like the idea of magical apparatus. Birds, yeah, trains, 8-bit computers, nice. Lego, astrophotography, baby wearing, space, perimenopause. You might get a lot of interest in that. That's a topic that still, perimenopause and autism still needs an awful lot of exploration. That does brutalist tower blocks. Every time I go to London, I go past the because I go into Paddington, so I go past whatever that one's called. The one with the separate tower. There's like the main body of the tower block, and then there's like the separate tower where I think the lifts are, and it's kind of connected by a series of things. I can't remember what it's called. It's the something tower, obviously. Trellick Tower, that's the one. Thank you. Thank you. But yeah, it's yeah, I love that. Oh, fantastic. Titanic, ballroom dancing, Regency history. Oh, you got on my dad on that. I have a print of it on my living room wall. Excellent. Pikmin. Oh God, I've totally forgotten Pikmin existed. Roses, maps, all of maps. Oh, this is nice. But look at the variety. There are some commonalities. There are, believe it or not, things that do tend to come up time and again. And I personally think that a lot of these things, it's because of the potential for focus. If you think about something like Lord of the Rings or Pokemon or trains or something like that, it's basically a bottomless pit of information, isn't it? You will never get to the bottom of trains. You won't. It's pretty much impossible. There will always be something else that you can read. I mean, if I go to one of those, I want to say antiquarian railways, but that's not the word. The steam railways. The kind of ones that are, looked after these days. There's always like shops and stuff that sell heritage. Thank you. Heritage railways. There's always these shops, and they sell books and DVDs and VHSs and stuff like this on trains. And there's so many of them. You would never run out. You would never, ever run out. And I think that's a reason why some of these topics come up a lot, because they are so rich in information. Whereas other things might be more esoteric, because maybe only a few people will be able to dredge that amount of information out of maybe a smaller topic. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. But the thing to bear in mind with this is, I think here I'm speaking more to the parents than any teachers in the room. We're happily here talking about our special interests, and the autistic amongst us are, kind of squeeing happily about the fact that we're even just getting to mention them. Don't forget the kids want to do that too. And they want to do it probably even more than we do, although that's arguable, I think, to be fair. And unlike, we're adults, so we're in a position where we can find our little communities. I can set up a meeting. I mean, if I wanted to, and I'm not ruling this out, I could set up a weekly Zoom chat where we just talk about special interest for an hour, and it would get populated, and we'd all be able to do that. Can kids do that? Have kids got that freedom? Well, probably not so much. The internet is a very dangerous space for vulnerable kids, to be honest, so it's probably not a very good idea for them to try. Kids often don't have the autonomy and the space to be able to talk about this stuff in the same way that we do. That they might not have that opportunity, so they might desperately go to siblings, parents, teachers, friends' parents. I mean, does anyone ever remember doing that? Trying to talk to a friend's parent about special interest when you don't really know them very well, but I don't know, they mention something and you're like, oh, I can talk about that. And and then you go off on one like you do as a 10-year-old autistic kid, and their eyes are glazing over, and oh God, horrible. But that's what we do. We seek out people who we might be able to talk to, because We haven't got any outlets. So, let's not forget those guys. They need that outlet for their interests. Special interests are great in isolation. They're great on an individual level. They truly are. They can be so powerful at helping us stay calm and safe and giving us a focus and helping us to learn. And they're wonderful. But they can be a tremendously social thing too. You know, on our own terms, ideally, but they can be such a wonderful source of social joy too. Getting together and talking about special interests with fellow-minded people is truly wonderful. Kids having the opportunity to talk about, you know, Super Mario or Minecraft to people who will listen and do care and might even be able to take part too is something that I think there's not a huge amount of it available to them. In schools especially. I think a lot of teachers feel like they're not paid for that. You know, I'm not paid to listen to Minecraft stories or break time. And, fair enough. And you could argue that you're right about that. But then in the next breath, they complain about the fact they can't connect to their autistic students. And it's like, come on. It's, the answer's staring you in the face. All you need to do is talk to them about their thing. You don't even need to know anything about it. They will just talk at you. They don't want you to ask any questions. They don't need that. They just want an ear that they can pour information into. So yeah, that always bothers me a little bit. Anyway, I'm aware of the time. It's 10:02, and I do need to be finished by 8 o'clock because I am tired and my head is hurting. And also, frankly, I want to go and have a look at the blue tits again. So I'm going to open things up. The chat's gone complete. I can't. I don't know what's happening in the chat now. I've had to throw my hands up. It's saying 67. That's too much for me. I'll have a read of it when it's finished. But if anyone wants to, I don't know, you can do whatever you like, really. You can put your microphone on, you can ask a question, or you can just say a thing. You can share an anecdote. You don't have to ask a question. I don't have to answer stuff. It might just be that you want to say your piece, and then disappear. I don't know what you want to do. I'm going to shut up now. So if anyone does want to ask a question or just say anything, then please do. Silence.
Hi, I'd love to say something if that's possible. I'm just seeing if I
Hmm.
can get my camera on. Pete, thank you so much. What an amazing session. I can't believe it went so fast. That was fab. I'm a university careers consultant. I work with a
Oh, okay.
lot. Yeah, I work with loads and loads of neurodivergent students.
Yeah.
My son is autistic as well, although I'm neurotypical myself, I think. But one thing that I try and do as much as possible, particularly if I'm working with students who are a little bit shy, a little bit reticent, I try and get them talking about their special interests. And
Mm,
the
mm,
number of times that will just break the ice of the
yeah.
conversation, get it going. But also the number of times we actually explore career possibilities
Yes.
that could bring in.
Yes.
And I just really, really passionately believe if we can tap into those special interests in terms of career, I mean, wow, that's just everyone's dream, really. But it
Oh,
was really
absolutely.
interesting, reading the chat and seeing how some people actually work in their special interests.
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
that's brilliant. Yeah, but thank you. This has been so, so great.
Oh, good, good. Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't want to. We can go over 8 o'clock if we need to. I just want to say something. One thing from my own experience, which might be valid for this, I don't know whether this is a common experience for people, but I always felt as a teenager and even as a young adult that my special interests weren't valid enough to base a career on them. Okay, I'll give you an example. So when I was 18, I was doing a history A level. I think I've given this story before. You might have heard it before. But when I was 18, I was doing a history A level. And part of the A level was coursework. You had to do like a big project, a big research project. And I oh, cheers, pig. There, no problem. If you do need to leave, please do. I won't be offended. But I had to choose a topic. It was completely open ended. You could write about anything you wanted for this historical project. It just had to have a thesis. There had to be a focus on it. A kind of question to answer. And I ended up doing mine on something to do with King Arthur. I have no interest in King Arthur at all. It's not really even proper history, but I did, and it was all right. But I didn't do it on the Titanic. And if I'm honest with you, I don't know why. Because even at that age, I knew so much about that event. It's obviously a historical event. it's actually got an awful lot of relevance historically. You can connect it to the kind of rise of the bourgeoisie, the rise of the working classes. You can even, if you want to be super clever, make links to communism, the First World War, the death of the Edwardian era. There's so much you can say about, the Titanic and its surrounding story. But for some reason, I didn't feel like it was valid to use as part of my work. And exactly the same thing happened about 4 years later when I was doing my master's degree in literature. Again, I had to write a dissertation. And again, I was casting around for a topic. And right in front of me, I was obsessed at that time, as I still am, with ghost stories, with especially London-based ghost stories. I love ghost stories set in London. I love the geography of London. I love the city. But I didn't feel like I could write about that because it was my special interest and therefore it wasn't valid. And I think it's because of that thing that we get as kids where we're told off for talking about the things we love. We bring it up and people just go, oh, for God's sake, here we go again. Oh, he's talking about the Titanic again. Oh, bloody hell. And I think you internalize that and you start to think, well, actually, these aren't suitable topics. I'm not allowed to talk about these things. The reason I'm saying this is because what you just said, about students, kind of waking up to the idea of their special interest maybe being a career. I don't know. It might be that it is actually necessary to tell them that's possible. They might not know it's possible. They might not think it's possible. If they're anything like I was, they might feel like it's a cop out, or you're not allowed to, or you're not allowed to focus on these things because you've been told off before. I don't know. But anyway, that's just my thoughts on that topic. Any other observations, questions, points? Oh, I'm liking the look of that thesis on architecture of Northwest London. Oh, nice. Excellent. Any other points to bring up before we call it a night?
Hello, Pete. Am I coming through?
You are, but quite quietly.
Okay, I'll try and speak up.
Yeah, that's
Is that
okay.
any better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to know what your thoughts were on sort of turnover of special interests and the sort of switching on and off. I mean, I'm late diagnosed. I only was diagnosed in September in my 50s, so I'm still sort of
Oh, wow.
trying to come to terms with things. I'm probably before when I thought I was NT, I probably thought a special interest was something lifelong, and they never changed. But I found that my ones can sort of switch on and off a bit, and wondered if that's a feature that's recognised.
Certainly by me it is. Yeah, I mean, I've spoken about that and written about that a fair bit. The kind of I get a panicky feeling when I realise that something doesn't hold its luster anymore, when for some reason it's just not having that effect. And it often is that. It's like I try and do the thing or read about the thing, and I just notice that there's just nothing happening here. It's doing nothing for me.
Yeah.
It becomes kind of dead. And it's actually I find it a really horrible feeling. I even made a meme. One of my Thomas the Tank Engine memes is about that, I think. It's like, I don't know, Edward looking sad or something, with when you realize that special interest is just gone and you can't get it back. So I think that there is turnover. In my own personal experience, I seem to have two categories of special interests. I have my long-term ones, which have been around since childhood, and they're mostly the ones I wrote about in the book, the really long haul ones that have always been there. And then I have ones that just come and go, and they might be more short lived. They might only last 6 months. They might only last 2 months. I don't know. Who knows how? I've never really sat down and measured it, but they're more short lived. And I've come to peace with it now a little bit more. I'm more comfortable with that kind of ebb and flow. I've never had, I don't think, one of my truly long-term ones ever completely vanish. I have had them hibernate, but then they come back. In my experience, they go kind of, they go dormant for a time and then they re-erupt, but they never truly go away. Whereas the more short-term ones, they seem to just totally disappear. Often without hardly leaving a trace. It's like they were never there. And I've kind of made peace with that now. We talk a lot about autistic ADHD people having that cupboard filled with hobby equipment of things that they lost interest in. And I think that is quite a common thing. I think, that is something that many of us experience. And, there's something to be said for making peace with it and just recognizing it as just being part of the whole deal. It's like your brain casting around for something that is going to hook on for longer. And sometimes it does. I've had very lengthy special interests, like permanent ones come up in adulthood. I think that it can happen. It sounds really corny, but it is a bit like falling in love, I think. You know, where it really connects and it doesn't go away. Other things are just more like crushes or rebounds or short-term flings, whereas sometimes you go deep and it sits around forever, you know, and you hope there'll never be a divorce kind of thing. So yeah, I would say it's something that's very relatable for a lot of people, to be honest. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Oh, congrats, Tigger. Just seeing that on the chat. Nice stuff. Okay, well, it's pretty much 8 o'clock, so I think I'm going to wind it up. I'm tired. I'm sure you are too. But thank you so much for coming tonight. It's been really lovely. I'll put another one on. Okay, I'll announce it on LinkedIn and Facebook in a bit. Okay, I don't know what the topic's going to be, to be honest. I'll just decide something. There's so much I could talk about. But yeah, I'll do another one maybe in about a month's time or something like that. But thank you, everyone. It's been really lovely. The recording, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it, if I'm honest with you. I recorded it because I didn't want to not record it, but now I don't quite know what I'm going to do with it. I might put it on YouTube if everyone's okay with that. If anyone isn't okay with that, then just let me know if you don't want your face to be on YouTube, and I can just do audio only or something like that. I can, I'll figure something out, but I will try and make use of it. Okay, right. Well, cheers, everyone. Have a good night and see you again. Bye-bye.